Great. So we now move on. We've been thinking quite a lot about the Caribbean, and we've been thinking a lot about this country, and we're now going to turn to West Africa and to Ghana, and following the cue that I've had from Evie on her introductions, you can read all about Daniel here. But I just want to say, this man, various people have made sacrifices to be here today. Some have travelled across the world, and some people have given up their daily 4:30 a.m. run. Daniel is that person. So he's probably got an abundance of energy now to give into this session here after lunch. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
I think my father will be angry with me. He will be angry with me because when I was a boy, he said to me, never make any big claims. And this afternoon, I have decided that since he is dead, I'm going to disobey him and make 4 big claims and then use history to explain the claims that I am making. So, Dad, sorry, sometimes we have to disobey you, don't we? My first claim is this. Mission, if it's worth its salt, has to interrogate the prevailing intellectual climate. Any mission, if it's worth its salt, it has to interrogate the prevailing intellectual climate. And by the same token, mission should open itself up for that intellectual climate to interrogate the assumption of mission. Are you with me? So it's a form of a dialogue. Mission ought to have dialogue with prevailing intellectual climate. If you want me to be a big Christian and be theological, just imagine that we read from the scriptures that you are in the world, but you are not of the world. So there are some intellectual assumptions that if we were to approach it from Christian perspective, we will query that. And there are other assumptions that we Christians may have that sometimes the world should have the right to challenge it. So any mission, if it's worth its salt, it should interrogate the prevailing intellectual climate, and by the same token, that intellectual climate should interrogate the assumption that underpins mission. First claim. Second claim, mission should be rooted in authentic identity. Any mission that worth its salt ought to be rooted in authentic identity, for that identity to affirm other forms of identities. Are you with me? Mission, if it worth its salt, ought to be rooted in authentic identity, for that authenticity to affirm other forms of identities. Claim number 2. Claim number 3. Mission should deploy right personnel for that personnel to give birth to even more personnel. Mission should always deploy the right personnel for it to give birth to even more personnel. For Jesus said, the labor, my father needs more labor in his vineyard. So when we deploy the right personnel, then that right personnel will give birth to other, even more personnel to work in God's vineyard. So claim number 3, deploying the right personnel. And then the 4th, mission, if it's worth its salt, should have clear vision and clear mandate. So these are the 4 claims that, having disobeyed my father, that I shouldn't make any big claims, I have made. Why have I made these claims? Well, this afternoon, moving to West Africa, I want to use 4 historical or 4 missionaries to illustrate the claims that I have made. I want to first, by the way, without stirring any missionary rivalry, the 4 people that I'm using as a case study, one come from Uspg, SPG as they were called then. The other come from CMS. One come from Methodist Society. I think 2 come from CMS, and then 1 come from Methodist Society. So I hope there wouldn't be any missionary rivalry after that. And I hope I will be invited again. Before I proceed, let me have a bit of a historical warning. I always say to my own students that history is messy. History is messy. History is sometimes ambivalent. History is sometimes ironic. And sometimes you encounter complexities when you are trying to unravel history. So I tell history students that the image that they should always have in mind when they are pursuing any historiography is to remove their shoes, for the grounds that they are going to tread on is a holy ground. History is messy. History is ambivalent. History sometimes reveals inconsistency and sometimes the most dramatic aspect of our human nature. So I'm not here to pretend that those that I'm going to talk about should have known better. That is why I have made those claims. That if there is any lessons that we are going to learn from these 4 characters, then missionary abilities to interrogate the prevailing intellectual climate is necessary. Missionary ability to have authentic identity in its own self. When you are comfortable in your own skin, then you can challenge whatever prevailing climate that exists. And when you deploy the right personnel, then you are not afraid what the outside world will throw at you. And when you have your own clear vision and clear mandate, and you know what you are doing, then you are not afraid of anybody. So, the warning that I want to give about historiography is the ambivalence, the complexity, the ironies, and sometimes the inconsistency that is within all of us as human beings who reveal themselves in history. So I want to flag that up. Having said that, now I can take you to West Africa. First, I want to point out that within our West African sub-region, we have love and hate relationship with missionary activities. In the West African sub-region, we have love and hate with missionary activities. And I'm going to use my own country's first president of the Republic, Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Here is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah addressing African state leaders who were fighting for their independence. We have had our independence in 1957. And Nkrumah, for whatever reason, has said that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless the whole Africa is independent. So Nkrumah meets statesmen at the time who were negotiating with either the metropolitan France or with London to have their political independence. This is what Nkrumah said about missionaries. And I read, "The stage opens with the appearance of missionaries. Then the anthropologists appear. Traders, concessionaries, and administrators soon arrive at the stage. Whilst the missionaries with Christianity employ the colonial subject to lay their treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust will corrupt them, the traders, the colonial administrators are taking their gold, their land, destroying their artifacts, destroying their culture, destroying their home industry." Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. The same Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he made this comment in 15th of April, 1958. The same Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, in December 1958, he was talking to Ghana Christian Council, which was very nervous because now that we've had independence, what is going to happen to Christianity? Because hitherto, the assumption has been that Christianity had been part and parcel of colonialism. So the fear was, with the colonial administrators gone, Christianity will also be suffocated to death. Here is what he said: "If you have time to visit widely this country, you will often find, as you travel along the roads, little cemeteries lost in the bush, where lie buried the brave men and women who, in bringing the Christian faith to this country, gave their life and devoted themselves to education. They know that they face the certainty of loneliness and imminent risk of death. Yellow fever decimated them and their family, but still they came." So here lies an ambivalent attitude towards missionary activities in Ghana. I am of the view that if there is any lessons that we in the 21st century want to learn from our historical past, which my big sister Rose and Brother Clarke reminded us in the morning, remember. We have to remember, and we have to remember the ambivalence, the contradictions, the ironies that are inherent in all historical analysis. The first person that I want to use to justify my first claim that missionary activity, if it's worth its salt, ought to interrogate the intellectual climate, and that intellectual climate ought to interrogate missionary assumption, is Reverend Thomas Thompson. Reverend Thomas Thompson, without him, I would not be standing here as an Anglican. Because he was the first person to appear on our show as an Anglican. Whether he will see himself as an Anglican is debatable. But he came as a Cambridge Don, Dean of Christ College, University of Cambridge, a nice Yorkshire man from Yorkshire. Sorry, we couldn't provide him with Yorkshire tea, presumably. He arrived having received a call from African Royal Company, the company that was dealing in slavery in Africa. The call came, we need a chaplain. It's quite extraordinary. This is a company that deals in slavery, requesting a chaplain to come and serve those who meet in the castle for worship. And as I will illustrate later on, as Rose said this morning, the castle quite always moved me to tears, actually. You have underneath the slave auction room, and above it, where the Eucharist will take place. So this is where he was asked to go and serve. The request from Royal African Company came to Uspg that we need somebody to go and serve, and therefore, on May 30, 1951, he was sent to what now we call Ghana, but then Gold Coast, to go and serve as a missionary and as a chaplain to the castle. Brothers and sisters, I have no doubt in my own mind that Reverend Thompson was a noble Christian man. I have no doubt in my own mind that he was willing to even sacrifice his own life for the cause of the gospel. But here comes my critique of Thompson. Thompson, like all dons in Cambridge at the time, has imbibed the Enlightenment understanding of what it means to be human. The lighter your pigmentation, the better you are to everyone else. And therefore, he went to the coast of West Africa, genuinely engaged with the people, and in my next point, I'll make a very interesting point about him when I come to the second person. Baptized children. Every Tuesday at Cape Coast and Elmina, where he was attached to, he would go to the beach to have conversation with the fishermen. Yet, in his writings, he never acknowledged the black people as equal. Because that is what the prevailing intellectual climate has taught him. We live in a time that mission is going through struggle. secularization, globalization, multi-faith society, and all the isms that goes with them. I want to suggest to you, however good our intentions are in rethinking mission in 21st century, if Thomas Thompson has anything to teach us, we may be good men and women, we may be on the fire for the Lord, we may have the ambition for Christ to be known. And all these things are noble ideas, without question. But what we cannot miss is constantly interrogating the intellectual climate which is prevailing in our own time, and allowing our missiological assumption to be questioned equally by the prevailing intellectual climate. So, Reverend Thompson, I salute you and I say goodbye to you. It takes me to my second personality. The second person that I want to look at is Reverend Philip Kwaku. Kwaku was, if you like, and this is where the ambivalence again comes in. Thomas Thompson's ministry along the coasts lasted only 4 years. And he realized that if the mission of SPG is going to have any influence on the natives must be prepared to serve their own people, which is the most forward thinking you could ever have. I'm talking about 1759. Somebody thinking. So before the indigenization, inculturation, and all the language that we use in our contemporary missiological discourses, somebody in 1759 had a vision as well. So he said, well, to prepare the natives, I will take 3 people from Elamina and bring them to England. So what he did was in 1759, he brought 3 people from Gold Coast to England for them to be educated, be prepared for ministry, and then send them back to Gold Coast for mission. Of the 2 people that he brought, the only person that survived was Philip Kwaku. I could bore you with Philip Kwaku all day because he is a historical figure with a lot of interesting things to reflect on. But that could be for another day. Kwaku was educated and trained for the priesthood in England for 11 years. He was ordained as a deacon by the Bishop of Exeter on 25th of March, 1965, and priested on the 1st of May, 1765, not 1965. 1765, not 1965. And was priested on 1st of May, 1765 by Bishop of London. I wish my ordination was like that. You are deaconed in March and you are priested in May. Anyway, mine wasn't like that. The fascinating thing that I have always queried myself and wanted to know why was that Philip Kwaku, to ordination, took place in the Chapel Royal in St. James's Place. And I've always wondered why. Is it to convince the British public that, oh, these people who live in the dark continent, if you give them education, they will just be like one of us? Or is it simply what was done at the time? In any case, the ordination took place. I made a case in my second claim that if mission is to have any effect, it should be rooted in authentic identity. And that identity ought to affirm other forms of identities. The sad thing about Philip Kwaku is this. Having been in England, having been educated for 11 years, having been ordained in the Chapel Royal in St. James's Place, Kwaku was sent to Cape Coast and Elamina with a very, very unclear mandate that you could ever imagine for any job description. He was to be a teacher, a schoolmaster, a catechist, a missionary, and a chaplain to the very slave castle where his people are being sold every day. How could you do such a job? So, whilst Kwaku, a black man, presiding over the Eucharist at the top, his fellow black men and women were being sold underneath the very chapel that he is presiding over the Eucharist. What sort of identity will you have if you were in Kwaku's shoe? 1 minute, you are one of us, because though we are many, we are one body, because we all share the same bread. The next minute, your own brothers and sisters, your own flesh and blood are no longer, though we are many, we are one body, because we consoled you. What kind of identity is that? My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, Rose made a point this morning about we have to demean the other before we can do harm to them. And throughout genocide history, it appears again and again and again. I remember when I found myself in Rwanda with my father, who has something to do with the investigation that African Union set up to look into some of the causes. And I remember saying to him that, Dad, is that how we behave as human beings and as Africans? And he said, you can only do that when you don't have confidence in your own identity. When you have confidence in your identity for who you are, then you can affirm other people's identities. False identities always create insecurities, and insecurity breeds hatred. So Philip Kwaku went with a very vague job description, a job that is impossible to do under the circumstance. What is so heartbreaking about Kwaku's story is that there was one time that he was mistaken to be one of the slaves. Well, you are one of them, aren't you? You are one of them. You may wear the dog collar. You may say, "The Lord be with you." You may recite, "Though we are many, we are one body, because we all share one bread." But you are being sold down there. So you are not one of us. Mission, if it's worth its salt, it should be rooted in the identity that we have been given by God. And once we are confident in our own identity as people of God, we can equally affirm other people's identities. But Kwaku didn't help himself at all. I have to put on record. Kwaku went to the coasts of West Africa with a very lovely English rose, which I always say to people, before you make any comment on race, don't overgeneralize. I repeat, before you make any comment on race, don't generalize. Generalization on racial issue can sometimes be very, very dangerous and unhelpful. Kwaku went to West Africa after his ordination in 1765 with a white wife called Catherine Blunt. Here is the most extraordinary thing. At this time in history, even those who go to West Africa to trade will not go with their wives. The reason why we had a lot of mulattoes in West Africa was that a lot of the traders will either marry or rape or do whatever happened with the black women along the coasts. But Kwaku went with his wife, who is English, Catherine Blunt. And the sad thing about Kwaku is, having spent 11 years in England, he went back saying to his own people that, "Oh, I cannot speak the Fanti anymore." So he could only communicate in English. But again, it picks up my story of identity. Kwaku was in identity crisis. So much so that he couldn't even identify with his own people as far as language is concerned. For those of us in ministry, whether as missionaries, as ministers of the gospel, or in whatever capacity that God has called us to serve, if our ministry is going to be effective, let us have confidence in the identity that we have been given. And by having confidence in our own identities, we will be able to affirm identities of others. I salute you, Reverend Philip Kwaku. The primary school that I went in Cape Coast was named after Philip Kwaku. So probably if he hasn't been around, I wouldn't have had a primary school. So with your identity crisis, you still contributed to the mission of God. Mission must deploy the right people who will be able to give birth to other people who can work in God's vineyard. That takes me to a Methodist missionary who ended up in Gold Coast, West Africa. Up to the time that they sent Reverend Freeman, Thomas Bed Freeman. So we've had Thomas a lot. Thomas Bed Freeman's father was an African slave, and his mother was a European. The debate still goes on whether an English European or French European, we still don't know. And that is not the purpose for me picking on that. But the point will be made that by virtue of being somebody of dual heritage, Kwaku considered himself throughout his ministry as Africa being his own people. And I will say something about that. But before Kwaku was appointed, Methodist Missionary Society has lost nearly 16 people between the period of 1835 to 1837. Why were they losing these people? Can anybody guess? Malaria. Kwaku presented himself to Methodist Mission Society. They told him, "You are not the sort of person that we want." He withdrew. People were dying. And when you go to, those of you who are interested, go to SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. There is a Methodist, what we call Methodist recorder, where they record some of their histories, and it's in their archives. Kwaku will present himself again. That here I am, you can send me. You are not the right sort of person that we want. You don't have the breed. You are not the type of Oxbridge products that we want. And then he will withdraw. And having lost so many people, the Methodist Missionary Society then decided that we will give it a try. And Thomas Bed Freeman lived in Cape Coast for 50 good years. Without the missionary activities of Thomas Bed Freeman, there wouldn't have been presence of Methodism in Ghana. And today, Methodism is one of the strongest presence of Christianity in Ghana. Freeman, having seen himself as an African because of his parental heritage, was able to dialogue with the chiefs. And I want to give you one of his quotes. Here is Philip Kwaku writing in 1841. Freeman. Freeman. Here is Thomas Bed Freeman, 1841. Freeman writes, "I embrace the opportunity of informing the chief of Cape Coast that our special object as missionaries was to introduce Christianity into his dominion. And for that purpose, we beg his protection. We ask for his favor and permission to build a mission house on his land." To which the chief answered, "I will protect you, and I will give you land to build your mission on." By virtue of who he is, he was able to enter into dialogue with the chief in a way that no missionary had hitherto been able to do. So when mission deployed the right people to the field, they are able to engage with the gatekeepers for effective results. Thomas Bert Freeman, we salute you. My last person, Reverend Samuel Ajayi Crowther. The CMS people who are here don't have a go at Uspg, okay? Samuel Ajayi Crowther was captured as a slave, and having passed from one hand to another, he was sold to the Portuguese in 1832. Remember that when slavery was abolished in England, it was still going on elsewhere. So the British never ship how to patrol the sea to make sure that they intercept ships that were carrying slaves. So during this interception, they captured some of the slaves that are being smuggled by Portuguese to Brazil. And among them was Ajayi Crowther. So Crowther, again, was identified as a young man with potential, and he was sent to Islington, was deaconed in 1843, and priested in 1845. The second black African priest to be priested. When Crowther was being sent, he was sent with clear mandates. And here was Crowther, the mandate that CMS gave to Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Plant churches and translate the Bible into indigenous language. And that is precisely what Ajayi Crowther did. Of all places in the communion, it is only in Yoruba language that an indigenous person translated the Bible and the liturgy into his own language. Is it now surprising that Nigeria is the biggest church within the Anglican Communion? May the Lord be with you.